Welcome back to the Free Mind Podcast, where we explore topics in Western history, politics, philosophy, literature, and current events with a laser focus on seeking the truth and an adventurous disregard for ideological and academic fashions. I'm Matt Burgess. My guest today is Justin Tosi. Justin Tosi is Associate Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He was previously a sabbatical fellow at the Benson Center and is co-author of Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk, and Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business. Both books in collaboration with Brandon Warmke, who was a previous guest on this show. We discuss an interesting new article of Justin's, which argues that censorship undermines its own goals. Justin Tosi, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Matt.
So I wanted to talk to you. This season, as I mentioned before we got on air, has a theme of looking to the future for higher ed. And you sent me this really interesting essay draft that you're working on about censorship. And so I wanted to use that as a launching off point, maybe for a longer conversation, either about censorship or about higher ed or about both, depending on where it goes.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So most of the time, when people object to censorship, the argument is either freedom is good, censorship is the opposite of freedom, therefore censorship is bad, kind of the libertarian argument, or, what you would probably call the million argument that, censorship makes us dumber and being dumber is bad, including the people doing the censoring, because, as Mill famously said, he who knows only his own side of the argument knows little of that. Meaning, even if hearing bad ideas, even if it doesn't change your mind, equips you better to defend your good ideas. You seem to be in your essay introducing a third objection to censorship, which basically takes censorship's moral goals on their own terms. Basically says, people who censor people, certainly these days, certainly on college campuses, right, often do so for reasons that they think are moral. We cannot have these false or morally objectionable ideas polluting our discourse because they might offend people, because they might lead to dangerous policies, because they might lead to believing things that are false that undermines good policies or harms people. In vaccines maybe being an example of the latter. And you basically argue that by making it explicit that you're censoring, and therefore that the censor is evaluating ideas and filtering them for their moral content, that any idea that does not get censored, as soon as the censor has announced him or herself, any idea that does not get censored implicitly is endorsed by the censor. And therefore, any bad ideas that get through the censor become endorsed by the censor, and that undermines the censor's moral standing. Do I have the basic outline right?
Yeah, I mean, structurally, that's about how it works. We can get into the details, but yeah, I mean, the idea is like, like you said, you can have these like principled objections to censorship and like defenses of free speech, or like deontic in character, just like you have a duty to let people speak their mind and so on. And I like those debates. I think my side wins on all of them. So happy that people want to argue that way. But I think like you say, another way of going is saying like, okay, tell me more about how this is going to work. And then I think once you try to fill out the details, even if you take the most plausible characterization of the aims of censorship, it ends up not working. So that's the strategy of the essay. Yeah.
So let's pull on that thread a little bit, right? So you give this really good example, I think, from Williams College, where somebody had invited a speaker who was known for defending people's right to air racist ideas, if I'm remembering that right.
Mm-hmm.
and a university leader, was it the president,
Hmm. Hmm.
wrote a message to the campus saying, basically, we're canceling the event. We strongly believe in free speech. We always thought that, free speech was great right up to a line. We hadn't found the line before, but we found it. Here's the line. And he pretty much literally said that.
Yeah.
Uh, and so you point out that now anything else that ever is uttered on that campus implicitly has the president's endorsement as not being over the line,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I guess my first question to you is, how plausible is it really that the president is going to miss something similarly, high profile and similarly over the line as he defines it?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I want to hear your response, and then I have a specific example that motivates it that we'll follow up with.
Good. Yeah. So, right. I mean, presumably, most people who want to engage in censorship, I mean, I don't doubt many of them mean well. Many of them are very smart. They maybe are often even very morally sensitive. They'll make a lot of good judgments about what sorts of things are really bad or maybe upsetting to people to hear or offensive or whatever you like. Um, but even with all of these points in their favor, I think it's just inevitable that they're not going to catch every bad idea, and in fact they're going to miss lots of bad ideas, and then as a result, you get this sort of implied ranking of these things are just not as bad as the things that we ban. So some of the sources of these errors could be things like we just have shifting moral standards. So imagine in 2010, say, or 2005, if you're real cool and thought everybody who is in the know knew already, you could have someone come in and talk about what we would now call a trans issue, and no one is likely to think, "Whoa, cannot have this person talk." Like J.K.
Right.
Rowling is already, maybe she's really early to the party in 2005 talking about about trans issues. Not
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
likely to stand out at that point as like a really hot button sensitive issue, or a lot of people, would object to hearing it, and so it could be allowed then, and maybe not allowed now. You'll also have we can call it in everyday language perspectival diversity among censors or those who are influencing censorship decisions. In other words, people are just going to disagree about which topics are the most sensitive, which things are the most over the line, and so you're going to have an institutional judgment that comes down that even the people who are in favor of censorship are going to disagree about. There and then they're also it's more like catch-all categories like sources of mistakes. Or, there's just too many things to evaluate unless you're going to have just an absolutely massive office of censorship. You're not going to be able to vet every expression on campus to see whether it is up to standards, and so some things will just get through. And sometimes it's just really difficult to evaluate particular works and say, this one is high quality, this one isn't. And as you introduce censorship, people get sneakier about working in kind of heterodox or forbidden ideas. Uh, Things that won't come will be harder to detect ahead of time, but in the moment, it's very clear to everyone. Oh, they were talking about that. Somebody actually our former employer, short term for me, long term for you. University of Colorado Boulder, Iskra Faliva in the philosophy department gave me this nice example. There was this kind of like Soviet era film where someone snuck through through the censors. This scene in a movie there, someone is selling newspapers. One of them is called Culture. And so someone comes up and asks for a copy, and the newsstand guy says, "Oh, sorry, there is no culture. We're all out of culture." And this is supposed to be sort of a dig at how things were going. So things like that we'll just get through. So philosophers like to do ideal theory. We, not me, but some of these people I like to distance myself from now that I'm in a business school. Like to say, oh, you're just saying people make mistakes. Well, sometimes the mistakes are very important and interesting, and they, the ubiquity of them, and just how easy it is to have people make these mistakes in judgment kind of undercuts the utility of having these highly idealized suggestions about public policy, and I think this is one such case.
So I want to come back to the point you made about the diversity of views among the people influencing the censors.
Yeah.
Because I think I think there are examples of that on college campuses recently that at a first glance provide ironclad seeming instances of your argument. And yet I would argue at closer examination, they maybe poke your argument a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
So
What do you have in mind?
let's talk about Gaza.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. So, many universities had a long history of both censorship and what you call in your essay censorship light. So we're not censoring you, but we're going to put out a statement saying that you're bad, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, so for example, when the former sabbatical fellow Eastman wrote an op-ed, before the election saying Kamala Harris wasn't eligible to be vice president because she was born in the U.S. to parents on non-immigrant visas, and he has this theory that the whether that's a natural born citizen hasn't been settled. I think one of our deans put out a statement basically saying, well, although I disagree with him on the law and I find, he should be stronger in condemning people who are misusing his argument for racist ends. And people are sitting there thinking like, wait, you're a chemist, like the dean. uh, uh, he has the right to say it, right? That would be sort of an
Mhm.
example of censorship light. Like I'm going to, wag my finger at you, but I'm not going to literally shut you down.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you could even, one level down from censorship light might be, affirmative statements of position. So there were, lots of statements, hand wringing and lamenting the Supreme Court decisions around affirmative action and abortion, right? So universities had these history of protecting students from ideas they thought was dangerous, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of people, including people on their campus, in some places, including faculty on their campus, started either seemingly or in a few cases explicitly endorsing ethnically motivated violence against civilians of the most horrific manner, against Jewish people in Israel, right? And so it seems like, okay, this is the textbook instance of your argument, right? And in fact, universities, many of them have responded in ways that maybe would be consistent with the advice that might follow from your argument, right? It's the oh wait, maybe we shouldn't be making public statements about anything because then we get into this spiral where we have to make public statements about everything. Okay, but so that all sounds good. That all supports your argument. And certainly I would say the people who are literally sending the statements and doing the censorship, the presidents, the chancellors, in my experience, they themselves, almost none of them are sympathetic, to the anti-Semitic views that were expressed on campus, right?
Yeah.
So your argument that they end up implicitly endorsing things that they themselves find morally abhorrent, I think works for the censors themselves. However,
Sorry, could you say more about that?
so your argument that, people who are censoring for moral reasons, right?
Mhm.
And then that means they're implicitly endorsing anything else that goes past them, even things they find morally abhorrent, and therefore they've undermined the moral purpose of censorship, right? Wasn't that kind of the argument?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I'm saying that if you're just looking at the presidents and chancellors in isolation, right, from the pressures on them, I think that the anti-Semitism on campus perfectly illustrates your argument that basically they, suddenly they were faced with this thing that they found morally abhorrent that was being uttered, on their campus, sometimes by their faculty, that they had, by not censoring, implicitly approved because they had been censoring other things, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, at the level of the presidents, I think your argument works. But here's where I
Mm,
push back on it a little bit using the same
mm,
example, right? Why had the presidents and chancellors been so censorious before? I would argue in many cases, it wasn't that they thought the things they were censoring or soft censoring or making statements about were actually uniquely dangerous.
mhm,
It's that
mm.
they were getting pressure
Uh-huh.
from other people on campus who found those things morally abhorrent.
Yeah.
Often, where they found themselves in an awkward position was that the people who were being anti-Semitic were some of the same people who were putting on pressure of them before, right? And so they weren't facing the pressure until they thought, oh, wait, maybe there are other people outside of campus that care about our morals, right? um, but I guess what I'm saying is, I think that there's an important distinction there, or at least I want to ask you if you think there's an
Mhm.
important distinction there of, from the perspective of the people who had been pressuring the president to censor, some of whom were supportive of these anti-Semitic statements. I would argue that they haven't necessarily violated their own morals. We've just discovered that those morals include, in some cases, some anti-Semitism, right? Uh,
Uh-huh.
and the president in my representative scenario, shall we say, I think where he or she has erred is, previously misjudging the morals of people that he was listening to before, right? And sort of thinking that they shared his morals. And then, when Israel gets attacked, finding out that actually they do not share his morals or her morals, right? And arguably the bigger problem is the public is discovering that, put all the pressures together, the university has a set of morals, right? Collectively, on average in its practice. Is the problem that the university has undermined its own morals, or that the university has revealed its morals to be sufficiently different from its funders and stakeholders as to threaten its political future, right? And that
Uh-huh.
is certainly a problem, but it's maybe of a different character as the problem you're describing in your essay. What are your thoughts?
Okay. So let me take a first pass at this, and I mean, there are many points at which we could enter, and so maybe you're more interested in other ones. Here's what I want to say. Um, I mean, one thing is, we can distinguish between sort of the views of any individual or group of individuals in this story, right? Of the people calling for censorship, or of what the president privately believes about any one issue or whatever, and then distinguish between those things, and then what the message sent by the institutional decision about censorship or expression of a viewpoint or whatever, uh, what message does that actually send? Um, so the
Right,
problem here arises because it becomes meaningful to say, or more importantly, to not say anything about a particular issue once you've started doing that. Um, right. So the undermining comes, the problem of undermining your own goals comes because we know in principle that when the university wants to censor something or wants to express a view, it does so. And so then it becomes meaningful when it doesn't. In some
right,
cases, this is what we saw in sort of the lack of statements that people
right. Post
were
October
calling out
7th.
about.
Totally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And
Right.
by the way,
So,
before we go any further, I want to put out the mandatory but also important caveat that when I talk about people being anti Semitic, I'm talking about, for example, the professor at Cornell saying the attack was exhilarating, right? Or people
yeah.
saying that, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, or barring, Jews from shared space on campus. I am, of course, not talking about the many people who are saying that the ongoing war in Gaza is horrific and there are many innocent victims, and nor am I including people who are criticizing the way Israel's conducting the war, or the West Bank settlements, or anything else kind of related to Israeli policy. Okay, just want to make that clear. You were saying.
Well, now I don't remember what I was saying because I was so concerned about being lumped into one side or another of what anti-Semitism means.
Right, but well, so I think you were making the point that when universities get into the habit of making
Uh-huh,
statements about everything, and now all of
yeah,
a sudden they're not, so let me give you a concrete example, right?
yeah,
So October 7th happens. Um, Before Israel had even retaliated, there were several scheduled and planned, and possibly one or two that had happened, rallies led, I think, by Students for Justice in Palestine, that were either explicitly or implicitly or both celebrating the attack,
uh-huh,
right?
uh-huh.
On college campuses. And, including, I'm not sure, I don't think it was very big, because I remember hearing about it being planned, but I don't actually remember seeing much about it. But there was one at Boulder, right? And I know that there were people who were asking the leaders, are you going to say something about this, given that we had, 4 or 5 statements about affirmative action from various people, right?
Uh-huh.
So that kind of illustrates your point. I think, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, one thing to say here is this dynamic. I mean, we framed this, and my essay is about censorship. But I mean, the dynamic is present across signaling decisions in general, right? So, as you say, universities. To take the kind of broader context, universities have been issuing all these statements about sometimes things that are I mean, obviously someone cares about all of these things, but about incidents or court decisions or whatever that are maybe safer to say something about. But then the cost of doing this, which they eventually found out about, is that, well, eventually, there's going to be some issue in which it is dangerous to say something about, and you will upset people. And now you have no way of backing out of this pattern gracefully, because if you don't issue a statement, then it suggests, well, this isn't as clear to us, or not. It's not as important to us, or whatever. So that it's a problem with decisions about censorship. It's a problem with official statements. All of these things. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I basically agree with that. And if I was, advising a president on whether she or he should make statements, I might even say, something close to that. On the other
Hmm.
hand, though, in terms of your argument, right, your argument is not that censorship is bad. I
Hmm.
mean, it is, but it's for a specific
Yeah,
reason, right?
yeah,
There
yeah.
are many reasons why censorship is bad. One is that they undermine the morals of the censor. And I
Mhm.
wonder in how many of these cases is really the problem that the institution undermines its standing in society by
Uh-huh.
revealing that it had been following a set of morals with its censorship that's very out of step with the rest of society. I
Uh-huh.
think,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think you could frame it that way for the examples we were just talking about around, say, affirmative action versus the October 7th attacks. Um, Now, I think the two areas where my critique would not apply would be, one, as you were alluding to a few minutes ago, the situation where there's just so many things happening in the world all the time that that omission is inevitable, right? So, why are we condemning, the war in Gaza and not, the war in Sudan, right? Or
Mhm,
why are
mhm.
we condemning, you know, anything happening in the Middle East and not what's happening, in China with the Uyghur minority, and any number of other things that are happening in the world. And then the other one is the, something slips through, right? So we uninvite the racist speaker, and then we don't see the memo about the sexist speaker the next day.
Right. Right, right.
uh, and then people are like, oh, okay, I guess the campus is not racist, but they're sexist, right?
Yeah.
In that kind of hypothetical example. And so I guess my question, I mean, the first one obviously applies all the time because how can you possibly, like, imagine if you had to start every semester with an exhaustive list of everything that's wrong in the world, right? uh,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
would just be
We're getting
exhausting.
there. Yeah.
Uh, but what about the other one? How often do things really slip through that are just as objectionable as the things that are censored and just as high profile? And could the leader in that case not just apologize and say, "Sorry, I missed that one," right? And kind of restore the purity of their moral standing with that set of morals.
Yeah. Good. So, I mean, I guess, of course, you can always issue statements after the fact or whatever. But then, that sort of makes me think like, well, what are we doing here? I mean, so censorship. Typically, the idea is supposed to be, well, we don't want to spread hatred. We don't want to amplify bad ideas. We don't, we want to protect people, impressionable young people, Matt, from hearing these terrible things. So, you can say, well, okay, uh, we will fail sometimes, and then we try to make up for it some other way. Uh, but then, I sort of think, well, then why do we need censorship at all? Why, why not just say, we'll just let people say whatever they want, and then if we don't like it, we can just respond, right? Or say, well, look, the fact that they are allowed to speak, that doesn't mean anything. They're allowed to speak because somebody thought it'd be interesting, and they invited them. That doesn't mean we thought they'd reveal the truth to you. So I mean, once you start admitting, like, well, yeah, people just come to universities and say stuff, or people publish books and, like, sometimes they say things that are false. I mean, why not
And you
just
don't have
admit
to like it, yeah.
yeah, why not just admit you've got an unmanaged marketplace of ideas where you just don't have this worry of like, oh, have to constantly issue corrections when things fall through, or oh, that speaker, we didn't think they would use that one example that got you upset. We would never have let. I mean, at some point, this is just sort of exhausting. All of it has a cost. So
Right,
why
but
not?
again,
Yeah, yeah.
I
Go ahead.
wonder to what extent you now have to assume million morals where maybe the censors don't always have them, right? So if the argument is that censorship is bad for freedom, 100% agree with you.
Mm.
If the argument is censorship is bad for society because it makes us dumber, again, 100%, 100% with you.
Yeah.
Do
Ye
people, given those two arguments, which are separate from your argument, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Do people who still choose to censor, right?
yeah.
Uh, are they being irrational? And
Gotcha,
and
yeah.
and and I guess the way that I've often intuitively interpreted censorship, um, really until reading your essay, which I really appreciate, kind of was pushing my own thinking on this. But the way I always thought of censorship is censorship is perpetrated by people who, for whatever reason, at least in the short term, have the power to censor and know at some level that they wouldn't win the argument if they had to have it, right? Um, a- and and in that light, it seems at least heuristically that you can find instances where censorship is rational, right? The
Mhm,
has
mhm, mm.
has censorship not? I mean, a comparison that they know that I've used a few times in different forums is like, you know, we have some very prominent disciplines in schools of education in many parts of the country whose canonical texts literally praise the deadliest dictators in human history, the communists, Stalin, the Mao's, right? And their seminal ideas are intimately connected to their sympathy for the deadliest dictators in human history, right? It would be like if we had, Nazi sympathizing education textbooks whose seminal ideas were directly connected to their Nazi sympathizing, right? If it was the Nazi example, society would lose its shit, right?
Mhm, mhm.
uh, and yet, in the communist example, people shrug a
Mhm.
lot, or
Right.
maybe they don't know. Is that not a tremendous victory from a pragmatic perspective
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
for people who are sympathetic to the communist or neo-Marxist or whatever you want to call it worldview? Have they not drastically increased their power
Yeah.
by their ability to harness and wield selective censorship?
Right. Right. Okay. Good. So let me. I think this happens a lot in interviews. Uh, I obtusely, you're like signaling for me to talk about something in my own essay. So let me. I finally, in other words, think I see where you're going. So we might understand kind of the goals of censors in different ways. Right. So on the one hand, you might have censors who have like the really idealistic version of the goal, which is we just don't want to be responsible for promoting any bad ideas. We're in
Right.
charge of this platform. And so, we've got to be vigilant and we've got to stop the bad people from taking it up. Right now, if this is your view, then my argument is a really big problem. I mean, actually that's modest. You're dead basically,
Right.
because
Right.
bad things are going to get through. Your judgment is not going to be perfect. It's impossible to have clean hands here, and so we might disagree with this. I
Okay,
kind of
wait.
think,
Before you go on to the
yeah, yeah,
pragmatist,
yeah, yeah,
let me push you a little bit on this one.
yeah,
If your goal is to have clean hands, right? Then I think what you're implying is as soon as you say you're censoring, whatever's there is on your hands. If you're not censoring, then your hands are clean because you're just not in the arena, right?
more or less,
Okay.
yeah,
So far, so good.
yeah. Okay,
But
so
what if
I mean,
the ideal hang on, what if the
yeah,
idealistic view actually is I want to keep my hands clean by minimizing the amount of bad stuff in my forum?
uh huh, uh huh,
Is it really so bad to not get all of it, right? Like could I
yeah.
take your argument and say, well, we should just stop parenting because we're never going to catch all the bad things our kids do, so why imply that we can catch any of it, right? I'm sure you wouldn't advocate for that. Uh,
Yeah.
so explain the difference.
Uh, I mean, well, so look, I mean, I think this is just sort of a silly view to begin with, but I do think it is
Sure,
a pretty
that's a
common. I
useful
think it's a
straw
pretty
man.
common view. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
look, I mean, this is the view of people who don't understand that there are trade offs, right? Or that
right,
actions have costs, even if it's like clearly the choice worthy option, it
right, right,
still has
right.
a cost. Okay, so I mean, I do want to say I think this is a very common like naive view is people just
Sure.
hear about something bad, they're like, we got to stop that, like we
Yeah,
can't let that
yeah,
happen, you know, and the point of the essay in part is to say, look, there's just no such thing as clean hands here, because of this dynamic of kind of seal of approval or endorsement. Okay. The other side of this, the view you can take, and the one that you're wisely, I probably trying to take up, is you can be more pragmatic and say, well, all right, fine. We'll wait and we'll censor some things. We'll take a stance on some issues or whatever. And yeah, we'll make mistakes, but overall, it's still like the best course of action, right? It's worth it. So I mean, I think I don't agree, but now we're having an argument about what the actual costs and benefits of censorship are, right? And what we need then is from censors is like an account of like how do you see these trade offs, right? How bad is it if you end up promoting a little bit of white supremacy or a little bit of sexism or whatever. But then on the other hand, you get to like censor a bunch of really bad, things you think are even worse, or that you
And
will. Yeah.
this is where your endorsement effect becomes important too, right? So you know, a college president listening to you might say, well, in the hypothetical Williams College example, yeah, maybe we let some anti-Semitism through in the fall of 2023, but we stopped the racism before that. And so the world that you're advocating for has racism and anti-Semitism, and my world just has anti-Semitism. And I think
Right.
the endorsement effect response would be, yes, but in your world, you've implicitly endorsed the anti-Semitism, whereas in my world, you have allowed both to exist in your space, but you have not endorsed either.
Yeah,
Is that right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So if you have, so right, the comparison is like free marketplace of ideas, where the fact that someone's allowed to say something doesn't mean anything, right? Versus one where you've got a manager or a censor, kind of, whether they realize it or not, putting a thumb on the scales and giving a boost to the ideas that are let through. So then, what we have to do then is decide. Uh, how much boosting of bad ideas is enough to tell us, look, even by the censor's own lights, this isn't worth it, right? And then we also should consider, look, I'm in a sense a liberal. It's also a cost in freedom. Most people will recognize to have someone telling people they can't express their views or talk about their thoughts. So that also goes in the equation.
And if you haven't heard
Um,
that argument, not just about the freedom thing, but just the social cost of people being policed, read Justin and Brandon Warmke's book, Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business, and go
yeah.
listen to the episode that I did with Brandon on that book.
Yes.
Sorry, plugging your
No,
book
no,
for you.
good. No, that's the best reason to interrupt me, is to tell them
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
engage with more of my work. Yes, right. So basically, you know, this is kind of the thought of the essay is like, look, uh, not very sympathetic to censorship, but I want to hear how you people think this is going to work, because I think it won't. I bet you can't give a plausible cost benefit analysis of censorship being worthwhile once you factor in the cost in bossing people around, interfering with their their rights of free expression, or limiting their rights of free expression, as you might prefer to say, uh, and importantly, by your own lights, in the cost of promoting some bad views.
Right. Okay. So one other thought I want to introduce, and that's I keep when we talk about your endorsement effect, I keep being reminded of Jonathan Haidt and others' work on purity as an
Mm,
aspect of group psychology,
yeah.
right? And where I think that applies here is, so go back to the hypothetical example I gave of, you have the one president who censors the racism but not the anti-Semitism, and you say, well, you've endorsed the anti-Semitism, whereas the other person who is allowed both to speak and in your argument has endorsed neither. I think where a lot of calls for censorship in what people call safetyism or safety culture come from is a place of purity where
Yeah.
you basically are your group psychology is wired to think, well, if my group's sacred values are X, if anybody in my group says Y, even if it's not me, even if I don't agree with it, even if it's written on the wall of our group that we do not think Y, nonetheless, somebody uttering Y has made our group impure, right?
Hmm.
In
Hmm.
in a rhetorical, moral way that maybe is seen by such folks as equivalent to like the broken glass theory, right? The If you had to rationalize it beyond just this is just people's irrational tribalism, right? You could say, well, it's well documented that if you've got broken windows, broken windows theory of crime, that if you've got
Yeah.
broken windows all over a neighborhood, then people are less likely to take care of it. They're more likely to commit crimes because
Yeah.
you've signaled that this neighborhood in a sense doesn't have a sanctity. Um, the would-be censors might say, maybe your distinction between maybe your endorsement effect argument is a trivial distinction because if we allow this stuff to exist, even if we don't implicitly or explicitly endorse it, it's created the equivalent of broken windows, in a
Mhm.
neighborhood. And again, whereas I, share your anti-censorship views generally, and this is what I would argue myself, but to steel man it, I think the closest
Mhm.
thing I can think of to that argument working is, you know, social media, right?
Mhm.
Where people, just anonymously say the nastiest stuff to each other, and that uh, does kind of pollute the norms and the atmosphere of the place, even if nobody's endorsing him. What's your response to that argument?
Yeah. I'm not sure what to say about social media specifically, but on the thought of
Basically, the idea that
yeah.
the endorsement effect exists whether or not you are a censor is basically is the pithiest way I can think of to summarize the argument I'm trying to throw against the wall, even though I don't
Uh,
necessarily agree.
uh-huh. Wait, so why think that? I mean,
Basically, it's the broken
yeah.
windows analogy. Basically the existence of bad ideas in our upstanding moral and intellectual community is inherently polluting to the moral and intellectual value, even if we don't explicitly or implicitly endorse it. And therefore, whether our censorship creates a possibility for implicit endorsement uh, becomes less important because we
I
have
see.
implicit endorsement in effect anyway.
I see. Okay. I guess I would. I mean, maybe I'm still not getting. I guess I would deny that you actually have an endorsement, any kind of endorsement, just from the fact that something exists in the community. I mean, you're right to say there's a cost to it being around. I mean, I mean, as much as I love freedom and free expression, I'd admit there's a cost to having people say lots of like nasty things and so on.
Yeah, everyone
Um,
should talk and vote except for the idiots, right?
yeah. Yeah, that'd be great if we could work that out. I
However, we happen to define those.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I guess, I'd just say, as costly as it might be to have these kind of annoying people around, um, I think there's good reason to prefer that set of costs to one in which you have uh, people, whether they think so or not, clumsily trying to manage what's allowed through, and so making it like more meaningful to the people who trust their judgment, that certain expressions were allowed. I mean, I guess, uh, yeah. What I really want to say here is just, um, sure, you can say we have these purity values. These one or two or three things are our most important values, and we just we value them so much that we want to protect them, whatever it costs in liberty. I mean, well. You've got to give an account of how much you value liberty to make your policy prescriptions about this uh, justified. Um, and
Which
I
again
think,
is assuming something of the censor, a moral trait of the censors that they may not share with you.
yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, I guess if I think if I'm arguing with people who value liberty so little that they think, well, it just doesn't matter if if people aren't allowed to talk at all. Not just it's not that important, but like it has no value. Like we don't even have to account for it in an account of trade offs. Then I think, well, we were never going to get anywhere anyway.
Yeah.
In having a meeting of the minds here. Um, but yeah, what I want to say is just look, you can always go for broke, promote one or two or three values, and ignore all of the other costs of that way of going, and that's something you can do. But I think it is not plausible that there are only one or two or three values that really matter, and also. Uh, even if you only have a small set of values, they're going to conflict, right? So, I mean, again, this is what we saw on university campuses, right? So we had people who think anti-Semitism is a really big deal. We have people who think the plight of the Palestinians is a really big deal. Even if those are your only two concerns in the world,
And
sometimes
we
you have
have
to
a
choose.
probably majority of people who think both are a big deal.
Yeah, right. Um,
uh,
Yeah,
but
so just kind of pounding your fist and saying we got to do something about this. You're going to get in trouble eventually. Uh,
Well, and your slippery slope argument in your essay is interesting too, right? The idea
mm,
that, okay, if the more we if we take your premise that the more we censor, the more we're endorsing things that get through, that creates pressure to not let anything through, which creates pressure to censor more. And if you're a normal person who thinks that freedom is good, then you've created a slippery slope for yourself.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the idea is, say you've got a free marketplace, and then somebody says something really awful, right?
Yeah,
You're like,
yeah,
we
yeah.
can't let that happen again. We've got to, condemn that instance of speech, allow no more speech along those lines. Well, now you've raised the stakes, right? Now everyone else can say, well, hang on. I mean, I agree that's bad. This other thing, so that sexism was really bad. This racism that you're allowing, now we've got to do something about that. Or you're saying racism isn't as important to eliminate from our platform as sexism. And yeah, now sort of run this argument across the whole universe of things that people might care about. There's always going to be some pressure to make the filter a little bit tougher to get through. And then unless you have a bunch of weirdos like you and me and maybe some of our friends around to say, hey, what about the
Us, the
value of
founding fathers, those
yeah,
weirdos.
right.
So
Yes.
let me throw. Okay, I want to throw two more provocations at you,
Yeah.
and then I want to end the episode by acknowledging that by saying we're going to argue against censorship without talking about freedom or about the importance of not being stupid as a society, we are tying at least one of our hands behind our back. And so I want to untie those hands kind of
Yeah.
at the end and talk about that. But first provocations, related to your argument. So the first one I will say is like is pretty cynical, and is maybe the censors would probably argue that I'm strawmanning them. And then the
Mhm.
second one is more of an attempt to steel man some of the censors, who obviously are not a monolith. And right, so
Yeah.
coming back to the example of communist sympathizers, right?
Mhm.
The If you zoom out from that specific example, another way I can think of that's admittedly cynical, but that I think leads to a conclusion that censorship is rational is if you view it primarily not as a moral strategy or as a truth-seeking strategy, but as a rent-seeking strategy,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So um, if my goal is to increase my own status, to cater to my own sensitivities, to promote my own group, or any combination of those things, then being a censor is good. And in fact, maybe creating a
Very rational. Yeah.
maybe creating a slippery slope is even better, right? Like if censorship begets more censorship,
Yeah.
then boy, do I want to be the person who's a sensitivity reader, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
has drastically increased my job prospects, right? So
Yeah.
so now I would argue that rent seeking is immoral, and so you know it's not really saying it's rational for an immoral person doesn't really violate your argument that it's irrational for a moral one, right?
Yeah.
uh, but I want to put it out there. And then the
Yeah.
second provocation, which maybe is more of a steel man, is it refers specifically to censorship in the context of a particular policy goal. And this came up in the discussion I had in a recent episode about whether or not academia has a liberal bias, right? And actually, in another episode about about academic
Mhm.
freedom and adversarial collaboration. Some of the most famous instances of censorship in sciences occur in areas where there's a problem that I think most people on both sides of the censorship would like to solve.
Mhm.
For example, a certain group is underperforming the national average in some academic pursuit, right? For example. And so most people, again, on both sides of the censorship debate, wish that weren't the case and would like to do anything they can to improve that situation.
Mhm.
And where censorship, that again, I think more often than not has bad unintended consequences, but comes from a place of good faith, I would grant,
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
sciences is where people basically, the gist of the argument for censorship is if we allow this idea to be aired, influential people are going to be convinced that this problem can't be solved and are going to stop trying to solve it. If that idea is aired and it's true, right? Or sorry, if that idea is true and it's not aired, then we may not be able to solve the problem as well as we thought, but we'll at least try. And so the outcome will be better from the perspective of solving that problem than it would be in the case where we didn't censor. Now, I'm still a million, right?
This is a steel
uh,
manning of this argument? No, go on.
well, no, it is. I mean, I think
Okay.
that the right, like if you say, like if you say, if you put out a claim, true or not, that implies that we will never close an achievement gap in a particular area between two groups,
Sure. Yeah.
I think people will rationally worry that we'll stop trying, right? Whereas I would argue there are, the worry that you often hear, that's consequentialist worry as opposed to kind of million philosophic worry that you often hear on the other side is, well, if we don't air this view, this argument, then people are going to do, quotas and, divide each other up. And my response to that is there are lots of better arguments against quotas than saying this problem can't be solved, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so if the argument is just like basically the argument comes down to like type 1 or type 2 error, right? Like we have
Mhm.
a beyond a reasonable doubt standard for convicting people of crimes, not because we think that's the best way to get to the truth of who committed the crime. It's because we think that we would much rather let a guilty person walk free than throw an innocent person in jail, right? So I guess what I'm saying as a steelman is some arguments that I hear for censorship sound to me like they're coming from a place of here's some taboo question, and if we think the answer is this and we're wrong, it's going to be bad. And if we think the answer is this and we're wrong, it's not going to be bad. And so I'm not going to let people say the answer is this, right? So does that make sense? And
Yeah.
again, I think in a million sense in the broader society that breaks down and it creates slippery slopes. And so I'm not saying that I'm suddenly a censor, but
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
but I think that type of argument um, is good faith and at least is rational in the context of the problem that it's being applied to.
Well, it is and it's not good faith. I mean, I guess, I mean, I know
Or
you're
can
not
be good faith.
saying, yeah. I mean, I mean, we're not. I mean, this isn't part of my paper, so I'm now releasing myself to
Yeah,
give a
sure.
more
We're
more
freewheeling now.
usual million kind of. I
Yeah,
mean, look, this is. I mean, here's an analogy. In software, people. There used to be this debate: is it better for the security of software and preventing exploits and so on to have the code be open source so that anyone can see it, anyone can see how the algorithms work, see any weaknesses, potential backdoors, exploits, or is it better to have it a closed system and so people just have to guess at where the vulnerabilities might be. And I say there used to be a debate because, as I understand it, the debate is now over, and people realize that it's a better approach to have, in principle, unlimited eyes on the code to spot errors, or spot potential
Oh,
backdoors,
that's really
uh,
interesting. Yeah.
versus
I see where
versus
you're
a
going with this.
closed system where it's only your coders versus every badly intentioned hacker in the world trying to break through. Um, I mean, look, what I want to say is you should have more faith in people if this is what you think. People are smart. Not
Right.
everyone, and right, lots of people will hear evidence and be convinced when they shouldn't be. But there are people on the other side who will probably, if we're in a democratic situation, cancel those people out who also seize on weak evidence for their own predispositions. And so, I mean, yeah, I guess I would like to say be more optimistic, be more trusting. Let yourself benefit from the smart people trying to make the world better,
So to
rather than trying to close the blinds and try keep it to yourself among you and your small group of experts or whatever.
so to apply your argument to the example I gave, would it go something like this? Well, if you let people make arguments that say this problem can't be solved, have faith that you're going to have way more people come and say, let's still try to solve the damn problem, right?
Yeah, or
uh,
you're
yeah,
mistaken. Actually, it can be solved. I
exactly.
mean,
Yeah,
there
yeah,
are a
yeah.
million
Good,
examples of
good,
this
good,
where
good,
people think
good.
they have an impossibility proof,
Yep.
and what you get in response is actually it is possible to do this.
Good,
And
good. Yeah.
the truth is all connected, and if you hide some of it away, you lose out on lots of chances to discover things you otherwise wouldn't.
Well, and this
Or
comes
sorry,
back
that
to
you
this
might.
actually is a perfect segue to the last thing I want to talk about, which is, let's untie our hands from behind our back and
Yeah,
defend, liberty, right?
yeah.
uh, and the quote that I keep thinking of is from Roland Fryer, I think, where he says, the truth has to be enough in the context of his work, where he's done, I think, as much as anybody I can think of in the academic context in uncovering how you solve achievement gaps that some people argue can't be solved. And much of his research shows that actually, if you do common sense stuff that doesn't always neatly line up with any ideology, you can make a ton of progress on solving these gaps, right? And so kind of the you know many eyes make us smarter. With basically wisdom of crowds, right? The free
Yes.
speech is good because crowds have wisdom, um, and because wisdom is good.
Mhm. Yeah.
uh,
There's a guy in a basement somewhere who's got the answer for you. You just
yeah.
gotta get the information to him.
Well, and this kind of goes back to whereas I could see how censorious groups can be effective at rent seeking, if you go back to the idea that societies are more likely to be prosperous if they're smart and free exchange of ideas are more likely to make societies smart, you certainly see the folly, right, in the censorious regime. So, there are many a dictator that has enriched themselves through censorship, um, but nary one that has made their society, prosperous in a lasting way, right?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that we, and this is, our, permit me to implicitly infer your age, our lifetime, yours and mine, uh,
This is probably generous. Yeah, go on.
illustrates this, right? When we were kids, I'll infer, um, people were talking about the end of history, right? And how liberalism had won because the censorious communist regimes had made themselves crumble from within. Even though they were kind of powerful for a while. And then along came China, right? And also some of the divisions in countries like ours, and so people are like, well, hang on, maybe history isn't over, right? Maybe we haven't found the most successful system of organizing society. But then what happened since then? I would argue, in China's case, um, they adopted
Liberalizing
liberal,
reforms. Yeah.
yeah, liberalizing reforms in some areas and receive dividends for them,
Yeah.
um, and didn't in other areas, and are now paying profound cost for that that's kind of undermining what was assumed 10 years ago to be their inevitable ascent to hegemony, right? In contrast, who is emerging as a success story defying the expectations in the BRICS world would you might argue India, right? Which is made incredible strides, for example, against rural poverty and against lack of access to basic things like electricity in their country as a democracy, right? so, so bringing it back, you know, yeah, I don't know. Is there? Would it be fair to say that uh, that that free speech and small L liberal societies still are unchallenged as history's most prosperous ones, um, for reasons that are actually more well understood than we think, and kind of does censorship not at an institutional scale sow the seeds of institutional destruction, even if it enriches a few censors along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Food for thought.
All right, that was too easy. Uh, as a way to end, right? Just kind of self-congratulatory
Yeah. Yeah.
million things. So let me add on a spicier, more provocative note. What is the strongest argument that you can think of for censorship?
Ooh. What is the strongest argument? Wow. Well, I guess I worry about arguments like my friend Rishi Joshi gives about liberalism kind of being committed to its own demise, that it can't preserve the conditions under which liberalism flourishes. So if it were to turn out that you could run something like my kind of self defeat argument against free speech itself, I would be very worried about that, right? So I guess the idea in very quick outline would be something like, well, if just leave people free to discuss any doctrine, any opinion that they like, that inevitably, eventually, they'll abandon liberalism, thinking and more importantly, they would abandon free expression, thinking that they have figured it all out, and there's no longer any need to let people say whatever they want. Then I would be very worried. But I mean, so then it's very difficult. You then have the, well, then what instead problem, because you'd then be abandoning liberalism to save it or something like that. So I guess I would say I would be tempted if someone could say, I've got a way of dialing it back just a little bit, and then you'll enjoy, uh, for an extra millennia, the joy of living in a society with somewhat free expression,
So
uh, versus 100 years of truly free expression. Then I don't know, that I'd have to think about that.
so let me try to answer that question, and the way I'm going to answer it, maybe isn't a great argument for censorship, but I also think it's sort of the closest argument I can think of that I genuinely agree with, right? So one is lots of people have thought about where the limits should be, right? You can't
Mhm.
shout fire in a theater, you can't, harass a specific person severely and pervasively, you can't call for imminent violence,
Yeah,
um, even in the US with the First Amendment, right? Um, the second argument that I would offer, which I actually think is easiest to see where this is important, and it's not oppositional really to free expression, but I would say it's additional, right? And I think you can see this best in countries that don't have explicit laws for many things, including free expression. And that is that to reap the benefits of a free and open society, you also need strong social norms and strong
yeah,
social capital, right? It's
yeah,
like you can't have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations without his theory of moral sentiments, right? It's
right.
kind of, if you want to put it in terms of the classics. Uh, and so so that, the idealized version of it, like, I think it is genuinely important to acknowledge that the idealized version of the free society is one where people have a specific set of shared moral commitments, not necessarily religious, specific religion, but have a specific shared moral commitments to, you know, order, to, nonviolence, right? To trust, to following the rules, things like that. And where I think, and maybe social media is an example of like what happens when you don't have that and you still have free speech, right? It's sort of,
Mhm.
is that worse? Is that worse than not having trust or free speech? I don't know that I would go that far, but it's certainly bad, right? Compared to case of trust. And I think that you see the importance of norms in societies that don't have laws. Like, so there,
Mhm. Mhm.
Canada, Britain, there's lots of societies that we have historically thought of as free societies that, never wrote down the First Amendment, right?
Yeah.
But didn't need to because we had these norms, these liberal norms. And then
Right.
all of a sudden, people in Britain are being arrested for retweeting things. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh crap, we should have written that down, right? uh,
Yeah.
and so it's like, the and so in some ways, that example illustrates the importance of having, laws around things like free speech, but it also illustrates the important, how far you can get with norms, of a good society. And X being an example of how far the other way you can get if you have, explicit rules of free speech, but otherwise, not great norms.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah. I don't know what else to say other than I'm glad I'm alive now in a society that has real free speech protections. I hope we get to live here a lot longer.
Yeah. Well, and, to keep the positive note going, I think that there are lots of reasons to be optimistic about this country. I'll plug my essay called "How Polarization Will Destroy Itself," which you can read in
Yeah.
my Substack.
Good one. Yes.
That makes as strong of an optimistic case as I can. And even if I'm wrong about polarization, we certainly live in one of the freest, safest, all around good societies ever, and we're lucky to be here.
Yeah.
Great. Well, on
Amen.
that sunny note, Justin Tosi, thanks so much for being on the Free Mind podcast. Best of luck in your new position, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
The Free Mind podcast is produced by the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can email us feedback at freemind@colorado.edu or visit us online at colorado.edu/center/Benson. You can also find us on social media. Our Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube accounts are all at Benson Center. Our Instagram is at The Benson Center, and the Facebook is at Bruce D. Benson Center.